So, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce Dr. Aoife Lynam, who's an assistant professor in the psychology of education in Trinity College Dublin. Aoife has an amazing CV. She was awarded the Trinity Gold Medal in 2009 for undergrad and the Trinity College Scholarship in 2012. She also received the second scholarship to do her PhD from the Irish Research Council for the Humanities and Social Sciences in 2013. Her research explored the experiences of bereaved young people in Irish primary and post-primary schools. Aoife lectures in the psychology of education, and she has gone on to continue her research in this area and has received grants to look at issues in this area. I'm really pleased to welcome Aoife today for our Trinity Research and Childhood seminar series, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk today. Welcome, Aoife.
Thank you very much, Imelda. I appreciate that. And thank you to everyone who's taken the time out of their day to attend. It isn't the easiest of topics to talk about, but it is an essential one, I think. And I just want to acknowledge that, you know, it has been a very tough 24 to 48 hours. People in Ireland are very aware of things that have been going on in the media. So this is even more sensitive topic to be talking about today. We're talking about grieving children, and we're looking at the role of educators. And I want to make sure that you feel supported. It is a very sensitive topic for many people, whether that's because you have lost someone close to you, or maybe perhaps you have seen someone lose someone close to them. But if this is challenging for you, if there's anything that might be triggering, please do feel that you can take the time to step away from this webinar to maybe come back. It is being recorded, so you can listen to it at a later time if you're finding that it is very confronting, the information that we're talking about. And I suppose on that note, I'm going to share a poll with you that you will see coming up on your screen. And it's just a simple yes or no question that, have you ever experienced any of the following? Have you ever moved to a new country? Have you had the breakdown of a relationship? The loss of a friendship? The death of someone you loved? The death of a pet? Or have your parents separated or divorced? And I'll just give you a couple of seconds, and I can see already that that's populating. And you should all be able to see the results there as well. That a significant number of people are all saying yes, that they have experienced one of the following, or maybe more of the following things that were identified there. And I suppose the point of this poll is to really make us reflect on the fact that we all, whether it's grief, it doesn't always have to be about death. We experience grief in many different ways throughout our lives. It could be to do with moving home. I know my background is also as a primary school teacher. And I know I've seen it with children in my class who've been displaced and who've had to move to my class, and that grief manifests. I had one particular student that for the entire year, we spent time trying to figure out what was going on in terms of her physical pain that she had. And by the end of it, we discovered that it was psychosomatic. So while she was feeling a lot of this pain, it wasn't actually as a cause of anything that was biological or anything happening in her body. It was because of the pain that she was experiencing psychologically due to having to leave her home country. So what I would say to you is, you see that statistic there, that the majority of people, 98%, have experienced, and it's continuing to increase as more people are filling that out, that the majority of us here have our experiences of grief. And self-care is a really important aspect of this topic. And you often hear that quote of, you can't pour from an empty cup. And that is so true when it comes to topics like this, because a bereavement can be significantly traumatic. And we see a lot of trauma, and whether it's through the news or whether it's through our experiences that we've had. So thank you for sharing that. I think it gives us all context to be kind to each other and to be kind to ourselves throughout this presentation. So what I'm going to do is talk about defining bereavement, because we need to know, what are we talking about? What type of bereavement are we talking about in this presentation? Because there are many different types of bereavement. I think at the moment you can see a lot of disenfranchised grief happening in Ireland, because of the awful occurrence that happened yesterday with young children. Even if we are not directly related to it, we may be grieving, we may be feeling that pain and that distress, and in a disenfranchised way. We're not involved in it. You see disenfranchised grief as well around when Princess Diana died. There was a real collective mourning that was happening as a result of that. So we can experience grief even when we're not directly involved. So we're going to define what we're talking about in this presentation when we talk about bereavement. We're going to go through the theoretical foundations of grief. These are really important because we need to understand, what do we know about grief in terms of theories that we may have heard, and how have they progressed over time? Because there have been significant developments in the theories of grief from Freud right up to present day understandings of what grief is. We're going to look at the stages of development. So we know that children of a certain age do not understand the permanency of death. It's a developmental stage that they're at. We also know that maybe neurodivergent children might have different understandings depending on where they are in terms of their stage of development. So we need to be really aware of what the potential responses and understanding of young people that we're engaging with are. And finally, we'll conclude with looking at some books, what ones might be useful for you to do a little bit of further reading, but also what books might be useful for young people to engage with, to feel that they're not so alone. So in the chat box, you can type into the chat box if you'd like and maybe finish some of those sentences, or you can write it on your phone or write it on a notebook if you'd like. But what is bereavement? Does anyone want to write down what they think bereavement is? What is grief? What does it actually mean? I've used these words quite a lot now in the last couple of minutes that I've been talking to you. So what is it? And what talking about death? Is it easy? Is it hard? Is it societally acceptable? I see people here typing in bereavement is loss. Bereavement is suffering from pain and loss. Lots of information around a loss, and that's a really important, that's a really key. A lot of you have picked up on that. It can be lots of different types of loss. Detachment, and that's a really important, Emma. Thank you for sharing that. Detachment is going to come up when we talk about Freud in terms of theory. Gillian saying that bereavement can be emptiness. What would people say are healthy strategies for talking about feelings then? Because talking about feelings can be very different for different people. Counseling, people are talking about the loss, a process, that grief is a very much a process. Lots of really important things coming through here, like Fiona talking about personal experience, which we've all alluded to. We all have our personal experiences that we bring with us. And Helen making the very important point that one size doesn't fit all. And yes, absolutely. And that's something we really need to think about throughout this presentation, that grief is so unique. It's like our thumbprint or fingerprint. We're all going to have different fingerprints. And that is what grief is like. We will all react differently. And even within the family system, we may see siblings reacting very differently, where one sibling very much wants to talk about the bereavement and another sibling might never want to speak about it. And it'll be the same for us as educators. We might have students that return to our class who never want the bereavement mentioned. And then you might have other students who really want you to talk to them about it, who really want you to link in with them. And I'm seeing Nolik here saying things that it's really important that someone can listen without judgment. And a lot of the time as educators, and I'm speaking from my own experience as well, I was like this, when as a teacher, very much we want resources. Resources are so vital and so important to us. We want resources to have something concrete and tangible that we can bring into the classroom. But Nolik has linked here something that is so essential. Listening is actually the most powerful thing that we can do. Listening, and that links back to the research that I've done with young people who are bereaved in primary, post-primary school. The number one thing that came out in terms of what they wanted in terms of support was acknowledgement. The second thing was choice. Choice in terms of what they were allowed to do. Were they allowed to go to the funeral? Did someone ask them if they wanted support? Were they given that type of choice? So that active listening is being mentioned, openly talking. I'm really delighted to see there's a lot of really important points being made here, and all really important. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. So the language of loss that we're going to use for this presentation is talking about bereavement, which is the state of having experienced that loss. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is normative loss. So we see what happened yesterday would be classified in schools as a critical incident. And I'll allude to that critical incident policy that we have in schools. But bereavement for this presentation is normative bereavement. It means that if Aoife returns to school and she has experienced a bereavement as a result of natural causes, as a result of an illness, not as a result of a traumatic event. So as natural causes, maybe it was anticipatory grief that I knew a parent was going to die. We are looking at that type of grief rather than the critical incident for this particular presentation. Grief is the intense pain that is felt inside, the internal experience of our loss. And then mourning is that outpouring. So what external behavior are people seeing? What is that external reaction to the bereavement and to the loss? And then the final one here is secondary losses. And this is really important for us to remember because a bereavement occurs, but it isn't the only loss that a young person might experience, because there can be secondary losses. And those secondary losses might be the loss of financial, the loss of finance in relation to maybe the person who's died was the main caregiver, was the main breadwinner in the family. And so as a result, there's now financial stress that has been added. We can also see with young people, particularly in relation to, it emerges in the literature, in relation to boys where a father has died. Often things can be said to them like, you're the man of the house now, it's you have to step up and you have to be the person who takes responsibility. So many of the young people that I talked about, particularly males, and particularly when a father had died, were given this responsibility and told by many people that they were now the man of the house and that they had to nearly step up. And as a result, they may have felt that they needed to suppress their emotions, suppress their own grief, because they had to take on a lot of responsibility. And for them, it ended up being kind of a loss of their childhood from that point. So that's another secondary loss. Due to the new responsibility, there can be a loss of childhood. So this is the critical incident policy that I was referring to. It's brought out the NEPS guidelines and resource materials for schools. It looks at, prevention by having systems. So what happened in the news yesterday would be considered a critical incident, where NEPS would be stepping in and providing support to the school. And as I said, for this presentation, we're not going to focus on critical incidents because a critical incident is something that overwhelms the normal coping mechanisms of the school. We're looking at instances where, as I said, someone returns to school. And you might be wondering why I went down this route as an area of research. And it comes from my experience as a teacher. And it was back in 2005. I remember the very first year that I was in a classroom and I was going to be substitute teaching. College had finished. I was going to be substitute teaching for the month of June. And I was my first day with a class of second class. And the principal came to me that morning and said, Aoife, I'm just letting you know that we'll call her Mary. Mary is returning to school and her mother died by suicide last week. And so for me, this was a very confronting situation. I'd never experienced this before. I also felt that I hadn't covered how to deal with this as a teacher in my teacher training. So that incident really propelled me to where I am now and the interest in this area, because throughout my time working, and particularly I worked in DEIS schools, I saw numerous amounts of loss, whether it was children who had maybe parents who were incarcerated or children who were separated. There was just a huge amount of grief that I felt I wanted to know more as a teacher so that I could take the correct approach to provide that support, because very often it is the elephant in the room. And oftentimes, and we see it happening all the time, if there's an issue and it's a societal issue like obesity, it's like, oh, well, the schools will fix it. And I don't want teachers and anyone in this webinar to feel that, you are responsible for making a bereavement situation better for children or to fix it. That's a big thing that we can sometimes feel that we need to fix it. And that isn't our role as educators. And a lot of you alluded to the fact that actually being there and listening is the most important thing that we can do, but it is an elephant in the classroom. And we see a lot of the research in relation to the one good adult and why it is important for us to acknowledge this. So in terms of how many young people out there experience bereavement, the Growing Up in Ireland study indicated that between 44.3% of Irish 9-year-olds will have experienced bereavement, whether that's loss of a grandparent, an aunt or an uncle, a friend, a parent, or a sibling. That is a very significant statistic when you think of the young people that might be in our classrooms experiencing this type of loss. So it really highlights why it's very important for us to realize that we are in loco parentis, as it says in the curriculum, but also that, you know, we will be there as a support. And perhaps for some young people, as was highlighted in both of the mental health studies done with adolescents by Headstrong and Jigsaw, that a study of youth mental health, we're in a really big group of young people, that one good adult is really important in the well-being of young people. And we see it in terms of identity development. When we look at Erickson, and he talks about how, you know, young people's development, they develop trust, they develop mistrust. So how they develop and when these events occur throughout their lives are very important. And if they're not getting that support at home, the other place where they're spending a significant amount of time is in school. And that can be viewed as a very secure second family for many young people. They're safe, they're predictable, there's routine, there's structure. And sometimes for young people, when they return to school, it can be a relief to be back to normality. This comprehensive My World survey, you know, looks at how important relationships are in the lives of young people, and that we are kind of on the front line providing that level of support for young people. So the role of a teacher, without our resources, without anything, we standing there in the classroom are the best resources for our young people. Research continues to emphasize, and you'll see this recent publication emphasizing that the environment plays a really critical role in young people's lives, that 70% of all schools are likely to have a bereaved child on the roll at any one time, and that those who are experiencing bereavement in childhood can have challenges in social, behavioral, and mental well-being that can develop through adolescence and again into adulthood and across the lifespan. But what we're seeing is that teachers are constantly saying that they have feelings of inadequacy, that they lack training, they have a fear of exacerbating situations. So I'm hoping that even though this is a short presentation, I'm hoping that still it might give you some information that might empower you to go on and to seek further information and to understand maybe the steps that we can take to support young people. You'll see throughout this presentation, I have a couple of quotes from some of the participants that I had met throughout the research that I've done into this area. And, you know, we all live in this idea of an assumptive world. We assume that when we leave the house in the morning, we will come back and we will, you know, the world will be as it was when we left that morning. And I think yesterday was a perfect example of how we all left our houses not knowing what was going to unfold that day. So for some people, your assumptive world can be shattered when a bereavement occurs. This quote is from a young girl who was in secondary school when her father died. The 10 years references that it has been 10 years since the bereavement when she spoke to me. And she said that she was a person now that was full of insecurities and full of sadness, that she knew that the world isn't this silly, dreamy place that it might have been before, and that you have to look after yourself a lot more. There's a lot of theory around grief, and you'll see as we talk about Strobe and Shoot and their dual process model, it's about 2 stages that they refer to, that often grief seems to occur for many people in waves. It ebbs and it flows. So this young girl was talking to me. She was in secondary school when the bereavement happened. Her brother had died, and she talked about, you know, it kind of improved in the first 6 months, but then there would be triggers that she would go through a period where she was very upset. Particularly when she got to college, she found that when she transitioned into an adult, when she was at the place and stage where he died, that really triggered the grief reaction again. So sometimes as a society, we can think that, you know, it takes a year to get over a bereavement, and then, you know, people are back to normal. And sometimes we don't fully understand that, no, there can be milestones and there can be triggers throughout our lives that bring that grief back. And that doesn't mean that we haven't gotten over our grief. It just means that as we develop, as we grow, we are reprocessing our grief and seeing maybe additional losses that we hadn't realized, or just reprocessing our grief again. And that is a very normal reaction. So this leads us into the theories of grief. And this is very much, as you can imagine, a whistle-stop tour of the theories of grief. Have any of you heard of any of the theories of grief? I'm going to put up Homer Simpson. Has anyone heard of any kind of theories of grief that you would know about? So I'm seeing a question coming in from Nolig. Is an expected death of a parent due to an illness considered a critical incident? So no, that wouldn't be considered a critical incident. It would be something big. Okay, I'm seeing here people putting in 7 steps that they've heard of this. Yeah, so a lot of people often have heard like that. You're right, actually, of steps and things like that. Anyone heard anything else? Yeah, Breed is saying, Sinead is saying it's not linear. Really important point that you're making there, Sinead, and we will be talking about that. Yeah, people are talking about steps. So all of this is kind of reminding people of things. So yes, this is often what people think of. They think of stages, and a lot of people often say things like anger, and I had heard of this as well, this idea of that you go through certain stages, you go through these notions, and again, it is infiltrated into media, like with The Simpsons, that we talk about these stages of grief. So a lot of people talk about that, but the idea of grief, will come to the stages. The idea of grief really developed from Freud with his seminal work called Mourning and Melancholia. And I think someone earlier in the comments had mentioned things like detachment, how important it is that we have to emotionally detach from the deceased, and the idea of decathesis, which is the withdrawal of emotional energy from the deceased. So what Freud was saying here is that if we want to kind of get over our grief or move on for our grief, it was really important for us to detach. Lindemann was saying similar things. He said that, we have to go through what's called grief work if we want to get over our grief. And he did this work with widows who've been bereaved. And he talked about the different maybe experiences like somatic distress and preoccupation with the image of the deceased, and feeling, guilt and hostile reactions and loss of patterns of conduct. So it's really impacting on people's daily lives. And he said that was grief work, but that then you would, go through that and you would do the work and then you would be finished. And it was mentioned there about that being a linear process in the comments. So Kubler-Ross is what Homer Simpson was referring to. This is the actual theory that is based on. And Kubler-Ross talked about the 5 stages of grief, but she didn't talk about it in relation to bereavement, and that people who had lost someone or people. What her research actually was based on cancer patients who were diagnosed and had a terminal illness. So this was what her research was based on. She did not do research with those who had been bereaved of a loved one. It was people who were facing their own morality and who were facing a terminal diagnosis. So she found that they experienced feelings of denial, anger, depression, before getting to the stage of bargaining, by struggling to find meaning. Maybe if they had religious backgrounds, praying for a change in the diagnosis before they finally reached acceptance. And what happened is, this is I suppose, as human beings, when there are chaotic emotions involved, we sometimes want to package those emotions to make it easier, because no one likes to talk about death or to think about death, but it is an inevitability. And so when Kubler-Ross presented her research with terminally ill patients, a lot of people took it and adapted it to bereaved people. And as it was mentioned, it's a linear process, because what can be misleading for this is that you see at the end there that notion of acceptance. That is, I suppose, where I see a lot of damage being done, in terms of people feeling that they may not have grieved correctly because they haven't reached that acceptance stage. Because as we have seen people, and as I've seen throughout the literature as well, when people talk about grief, they don't talk about this, I'm over it, it's finished, and now I move on. Because you will always have that person as part of your life. You will always think about them. It's not like you can switch an off button and then you never think about them again and you never grieve again. For many people, that stage of acceptance can lead them to feel like maybe I haven't grieved properly and rightly, and that's where it can be damaging. And also the emotions like denial, anger, and depression, and bargaining and acceptance, you could go through them all in an hour and then go back to, you know, depression again, and or you could go through all of them 5 or 6 times in a week or 2 weeks. You know, it's not a linear process, and Kubler-Ross never intended us to apply her theory in relation to those who are grieving a loved one. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember, because sometimes it can be misunderstood. And you see, even in the critical incident policy, it refers to, and this is where we need to be careful, it refers to certain things that denial, numbness, and shock can last up to 6 weeks. Or then acute grief might happen from 6 to 4 months. But I think it's important for us to remember we can't put a timeline on grief. And as it was mentioned in the comments, there isn't a one size fits all, because what can happen is if we put a timeline of like this 18 months, you know, we may feel like we haven't grieved in the correct way, or we haven't, I suppose, gotten over it. But actually, that's not what we should be aiming for. Grief is a very normal human experience. And it can, you'll see with the newer theories, there are different perspectives now that we put, that we consider when we talk about grief. Attachment would have been also an important area that was considered in grief theory, looking at the attachment that a young person has to the person who has died, whether that's a positive attachment or a negative attachment that can influence the way in which that they grieve. So a lot of longitudinal studies, so studies that are done over time, they fail to provide evidence that says that grief fits into a model of stages. And that's really important as we move into the newer models of grief. So there isn't that empirical evidence that is saying, yes, people do go through these stages and eventually reaches a conclusion and you reach the acceptance. So I think that's important to remember as we go in to the post-1990 theories of grief. So in Warden's tasks, he talks about, you know, when we are grieving, we have to first accept the fact that the loss is real. Then we have to experience the emotional pain of grief. Then we have to adjust to the environment without the deceased. And then we finally have to reinvest our emotional energy into another relationship. Now, I would have put Warden, I've divided the theories into pre-1990 and post-1990, but had Warden not adapted his theories, it wouldn't have been as neat as that, because Warden's tasks kind of have a conclusion there. But what he did following research and seeing what was emerging, he added an additional task, which really encompasses the newer models of grief, which says that actually finding an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life is very important. And this is where the distinction between the pre-1990 theories happens with Freud, who was talking about if you were grieving, you need to detach, or you need to reach acceptance, or you need to move on. You know, all of these notions of a finality really have kind of gone into the past, and we are moving now into the newer theories that say no, having an enduring connection is actually very healthy and more realistic of the grief experience for young people. Klaas, Silverman, and Nickman talk about the importance of continuing bonds, that as our new understanding of grief is emerging, we know that it isn't unhealthy to have a continuing bond with the deceased, because you will hear people talking, having ways that they might communicate with the deceased. And if we think that that is unhealthy, obviously there will be aspects, if it is impacting on people's daily functioning and it's stopping them from living their lives or reinvesting in new relationships, that is obviously an unhealthy bond. But in general, keeping that person's memory alive is not considered unhealthy. And here's an example of it, I suppose, in terms of collective grief. This was a wind phone that was set up. It was actually part of an art exhibition that happened following an earthquake. And the idea of this wind phone was that you could come and talk to your loved one. So there was a high number of fatalities, and this was set up as kind of just a space. And it was, again, as I said, an art exhibition. It wasn't, I suppose, set out to have the reaction that it did. But what happened is hundreds of thousands of people started flocking to this site and going in and having that moment and that time, similar to what we would do in terms of graves and graveyards, go and talk to our loved one. And I think the view is that now we don't need to see that as unhealthy. Particularly, we're seeing a lot of emerging literature in relation to kind of digital legacies. And I haven't time to go through that as much in this presentation, but it is an interesting aspect, particularly if you're working with adolescents who may have, if there's someone who has died and they have an online presence, they may get more comfort through communicating online with that person. Maybe there's a Facebook page and they still put up comments, or they write messages to that person as a way of continuing that bond. And it can be a healthy way of continuing to process that bereavement and that grief for that young person. I'm going to show my bias a little bit here, because this dual process model, I feel, is perhaps the best way I have seen to describe grief. And again, that's just my view. There are no grief theories specifically aimed at children. But I think for us as educators or anyone working with young people, this is a particularly good theory, because it talks about two types of behaviors. And it's like the waves. It's like the ebbing and flowing. So we can have loss-oriented behavior, where we are immersed in our grief. We are looking backwards, and we are really missing that relationship, that loved one. So that might happen in the morning time. And then in the afternoon, we might say, oh, I'm going to, go out. I'm going to look forward. I'm going to adjust to my new life. Maybe I'm going to get involved in a new hobby. Maybe I'm going to go and meet new people. Maybe I'm going to do something that I haven't done before. I'm investing and adjusting to a new life without the deceased. And I have that continuing bond with my loved one. I still have a photograph of them in a necklace that I'm wearing. I still talk about them. That's the continuing bond. So what Strobe and Shute are saying is that for a person who's grieving, they will oscillate between these two types of behavior. And there might be milestones that happen. There might be triggers where we spend maybe some time in that loss-orientated behavior. But then we move back again into the restorative-oriented behavior. And that as time goes on, maybe the gaps extend between those types of behavior. And that is kind of the newer model of thinking in relation to bereavement and how we grieve. Another theory that I think is particularly relevant for educators is around meaning making. We see a lot of this in narrative psychology. Niemeyer talks about, the story of a person's life being like a book. And we all have stories about our lives. We have in our minds nearly a film roll of how we think our lives are going to go. And that's what I was referring to in the assumptive world. When we have a world in which we assume how our lives are going to go, and when a bereavement or a trauma happens, that assumptive world is shattered. So Niemeyer refers to that book, the book of our lives. And they say that after a bereavement, the chapters that were to be written are now ripped out of the book. And so because that person who was supposed to be in those chapters is now gone. And the aim of supporting bereaved is to allow people who are grieving and young people who are grieving to develop a new narrative about their lives. So what are their future chapters going to look like now? And how can you bring that continuing bond and keep that person in your heart and in your memory? It's interesting that Freud talked about the detachment, because he didn't do any further work on his theory, but we do have a letter that he wrote to his friend Ludwig Binswanger, following Binswanger's own experience of bereavement. Now, when Freud wrote that letter, he had actually experienced the bereavement of his daughter. And in that letter, he alluded to the notion of a continuing bond where the people that have died will always remain part of us and always be part of in our hearts and part of the decisions that we make. And I think that's interesting. I think it's a pity that Freud didn't develop his theory more, because perhaps given his own personal experience, it seems from that letter that he understood that idea of an enduring connection, that it's not a sense of you detach and then you carry on. So again, this idea of a new narrative that we create is very important. You know, that we no longer view grief as a medical condition that needs to be cured, that needs to be healed. Now, of course, there are absolutely going to be some instances where grief may lead to the need for clinical support, where it may need psychological interventions. But generally, we're looking at grief as a normal response to our human emotions, and that, you know, we don't always need to medicalize it. So just to summarize the theories, you'll see these two images, and the top one shows shrinking grief. So they're kind of the pre-1990 theories, where it was believed that actually what you were trying to do was always trying to shrink your grief, make it smaller and get to the point where it would disappear, and then you would be over it. And that can be very hard for people who never feel that they achieve that. Whereas the post-1990 theories of grief are telling us, no, your grief is going to be there because the love you've had for that person is always going to remain. You're never going to not love that person. And so growing your world is what happens, that your world gets bigger because of the new relationships you develop, the new activities, the new hobbies, and the new maybe social interactions that you have. So that instead you're growing your world around the deceased. And that's how we support ourselves as we go through grief. We kind of immerse ourselves in positive social reactions as we oscillate between grief and reinvesting in our new lives. So the contemporary thoughts are that there is no end point to mourning, that the relationship doesn't have to end. Instead, it might be reincorporated in new ways, and that remembering is actually comforting and life enhancing, because trying to force ourselves to forget can be very difficult. The Irish Childhood Bereavement Network, if you haven't heard of them, they're doing tremendous work in terms of supporting young people. You can find their website at childhoodbereavement.ie. I sit on the advisory board for the network, and they developed this bereavement care pyramid that I think is very powerful and useful for understanding the support needs of young people. So if you look down at the bottom, it's saying that this is what most people will need. Most people and young people will experience occasional physical symptoms after grief, and that is normal. Children might have questions. They might want to have routine and schedules, and that it's really important that you give accurate and honest, appropriate information. What's really key here is that we don't say things like, and this is where I suppose covering up issues in order to protect children, and when it's done with the best of intentions, it can actually end up being a little bit harmful, because particularly when it comes to bereavement like suicide, often, depending on a child's age, we might want to protect that child. And so we might say, oh, it was an illness rather than a suicide. But what might happen then is that that child hears from someone in the schoolyard that it was a suicide. And what that does is that leads to mistrust. And then that child knows that they cannot trust that the adults are going to tell them the truth. There are a lot of peer support programs that can support children. Rainbows Ireland is a very good peer support program for young people. And in that, they really emphasize this. They emphasize that if children can only take part in their peer support programs if they have the true and truthful information about the bereavement. Because as teachers, we cannot collude in misinformation, because then that breaks the trust that the child has in us, and we might be that one good adult that child needs in our lives. So for young people, you might at this stage, you can get information from websites, leaflets, And there can be a lot of family and community-based support that you can access at that stage. And it's really important then that we understand young children's reactions, we understand their level of need and the awareness of how to access services. Level 2 and level 3 then emphasize that some children, so for most children, they're not going to need that clinical support, that the family support, the community-based support, and the information available online will be enough. When a bereavement happens, we don't need to automatically assume that we need to find therapy or psychological interventions, because the reaction, if it's physical, if the child is upset and crying, we need to acknowledge that that is very, very normal, and that only a smaller percentage of children will need that psychological intervention. So at level 2, we might see regressive behavior. We might see people constantly questioning. There might be diminished coping, and children might be feeling isolated. There is a link, and it emerged in my research that some children who went back to school, because they were seen as different, if maybe the other children in the class hadn't been spoken to about the bereavement, they nearly want to stay away from Aoife, because what if this bereavement is contagious? And the other flip side of that is sometimes, if Aoife returned to the classroom, Aoife's teacher might be really kind and wanting to help Aoife, and so might give her preferential treatment. And other children might see this and say, well, why is Aoife getting preferential treatment? And I specifically remember one example that a teacher gave me. She told me about when a child had returned to her class who'd been bereaved, and she was really like that, trying to be really kind and supportive. And she let the child skip a cue for something. And one of the children in the class turned around and said, just because your dad died doesn't mean you get to skip the cue. So I suppose that's where we need to be aware of actually trying to behave as normally as possible, but also, and that doesn't do anything that might make the child feel more different than they're already feeling, because the routine and the normality is what children are coming back to. And when a child is, before they come back to class, speaking to the other children in the class and, answering their questions, bereavement is covered in the SPHE curriculum, and talking about death is part of what we can do as teachers. Sometimes we can shy away from that because we can be fearful that it might make things worse for young people. But certainly it can be important to let maybe families know when you're going to talk about this topic, and link in with that family support as well, and with parents. And so that we can provide a really open environment where children can ask questions instead of having these suppressed fears that they're not understanding. So in level 2, we see that meeting others with similar experiences can be helpful. And this could be done through rainbows groups with children. There's other groups like Seedlings, and there's another one, I can't think if it's an Australian-based one that I can't think of the name right now, but there are other ones, but I know that Rainbows has been extremely successful in many schools and in many communities. And for the level 3, you see additional needs. So if people are having, continuous symptoms over time, and if it starts, and this is where a teacher is important because you're on the front line, if you're noticing that it's impacting on day-to-day functioning, our job isn't to be the counsellor, it isn't to fix this for young people, but our job can be to observe, to link in with families, and to refer where appropriate. And you see there that very few will lead to suicidal ideation, it will lead to self-harming, and specialist mental health and psychotherapy resources will be needed in those instances. So I think this is a useful pyramid to understand that for most, the family and community support will be enough. For some, they might need that Rainbows intervention, or maybe an appropriate child-centered intervention like one-to-one play therapy. And then for very few, they might need that really specialist service after a bereavement. In terms of the research, I've done further research after my PhD looking at pre-service teachers, because as a pre-service teacher, I did see bereavement that was happening. So this was research that we were funded by Scotans for, to look at how teachers were responding, and it took place across Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And that many, you see over half 51% had encountered students who'd been bereaved while they were on school placement. And one quote here saying, "From my own experience as well on placement, I encountered 3 separate pupils who were either recently bereaved or had recently experienced separation or divorce." When they asked about their confidence, half of them were saying that they weren't confident, that they were unsure, which means that 52% were feeling confident. And when we asked them, How would they support a child? Many of them said that they would rely on their personal intuition. And we can see here from this presentation that many of us actually did have had, and the majority of us have had our own experiences of grief in different formats. And again, what we need to be careful of in terms of relying on personal intuition is that we don't either re-trigger ourselves and re-traumatize ourselves. And we don't also, if we've had a negative experience, then we don't pass that on. So again, knowing the correct approaches can be very empowering to help us when we are talking to young people. We know that in terms of training, connecting with young people is very important. And a lot of the research saying that, young teachers need to, at the pre-service teacher level, need to have the theoretical knowledge first in order to understand what's happening. So in terms of your role and what key factors you need to think about in terms of a bereavement response, it's really important that we look at the circumstances of the death, how the death has occurred. We look at the developmental age and understanding of death and loss. That we look at the nature of the attachment that young person had to the person who has died. It can be a positive attachment. It can be a negative, maybe it's a disrupted attachment where that can add its own complications and afterwards can make the grief very complicated because there might be lingering feelings of things that were unsaid, things that were unspoken, lingering anger and ambiguity, that it can actually make that grief more complicated as a result. The reaction and coping of other family members. So how are the remaining family members responding to this loss? We also need to consider as teachers, what are the previous losses that young people have experienced? And what are the cultural and belief systems that young person has? And I'm thinking of an example that I was told around a young person where their father had died, and again, with the very best of intentions, the remaining parent had not told the child for 3 days. And so the child was being removed around to friends of the family. And the parent, because they're grieving themselves, had arrived to the school and asked the school to tell the child who was bereaved that the father had died. So this can bring a lot of challenges. And also when there are different cultural beliefs, I've heard teachers say that it's very hard because oftentimes we can say things like, your dad is in heaven, they're looking down on us and guardian angels. And we can use maybe what we've brought up with our own personal experiences of religion as a crutch sometimes to help. But then that isn't always going to be applicable in every situation and isn't always going to be appropriate. So figuring out the cultural and belief systems is important. And what's the level of natural self-esteem and confidence and resilience that child has? These are key factors to keep note of. Now, my time has unfortunately run out and I have many more slides, but what I'm going to do is make those available. I'm sure I'll ask Jenny if we have availability to make the slides available online so that you can see, because I have some book recommendations and things like that would be useful. We have, as part of the Irish Childhood Bereavement Network, we actually developed a book list, and I will scoot on down. This is kind of the stages of development. You can see I sometimes over prepare for these things. But this is, I suppose, one of the really good books. I'll finish on this by Sconfeld and Quackenbush, because as a teacher, I found back like in 2005, the issue that I faced when I had that young girl returning to my class was, what am I going to say? And how am I not going to make things worse? So this book, it's called The Grieving Student. And if there was one book that schools should have, I would recommend this one, because it gives you lots of useful tips on what to say, what not to say, why you shouldn't say that, and what you can say instead. And I found this, when I came across it, very empowering, because it's not about having all of the resources. And that's why we developed the list of books with the Irish Childhood Bereavement Network. It's available on childhoodbereavement.ie. If you go Google picture books on ICBN, it'll come up. We developed a list of books, and it really came from one of the focus groups I did. There was a very well-intentioned teacher like that. I recognized myself in her, that when you really want to help and support young people, we do everything we can. And as teachers, we love to have resources. And this teacher told me that she had heard during the summer that a young girl in her class had experienced a bereavement. So she said she Googled it and she saw this book called Sad by Michael Morpurgo. And she drove to 3 different libraries to try to get this book so that she was prepared on day 1 to read this book about sad feelings. And that book, and that's why we have to be really critical about the types of books that we use. Not every book is going to be appropriate. And that's what that resource on childhoodbereavement.ie talks about. What books are appropriate and when they're appropriate to use. Because day 1, a child returning to school, we wouldn't recommend that you use a book. And actually, the majority of books that are very useful, there are some fantastic, really helpful books out there for children to understand the grief. Most of them are not suitable to use in the classroom. Most of them, as a teacher, I would now use them to recommend to parents to maybe do one-on-one with the child, and to then maybe come to the teacher one-on-one, and we can link in and support together. So that list is there for you. But this Sconfeld and Quackenbush book is excellent, The Grieving Student, because they say, don't say things like, I know just what you're going through, because we don't know everyone's experience. We alluded to at the start, if there's not a one-size-fits-all with grief, then instead use open-ended questions like, can you tell me more about what this has been like for you? So I'm going to show you one more slide and then I'm finishing, I promise. And this is what not to say. So don't say this is hard. Instead say it's what kind of memories do you have about the person who has died? So lots of these useful strategies and sentences and questions that you can use. So thank you very much for listening. I know it can often be a triggering and a tough subject, and I'm delighted to see that so many of you linked in and have stayed present with us today for this presentation. And yeah, I'll open the floor and pass over to Imelda now for any questions that we might have.
Aoife, that was absolutely fantastic. And I've learned a lot as well. You know, when we encounter children in the hospital setting who have experienced bereavement. So so many important points you made there. Some questions have come through, and one of them from Monica is it pain shopping if a child is constantly listening and watching videos of their deceased sibling?
I think the thing we need to look at is, for some young people, it will be very helpful. What we need to look out for is when it impacts on their daily functioning. If they're stopping socializing with their friends in order to watch those videos, if they're maybe becoming more detached, if they're internalizing a lot of their behavior and they're not linking in with their friends as much, that's when it would raise a concern. But if everything else is continuing as normal, I would say that might just be a comfort, that young person is, you know, looking at, they're remembering and they're keeping that memory alive. And that actually can be that continuing bond for that young person. Yeah,
what you were saying earlier, it's not about accepting it and moving on and never being able to talk about it or even watch old videos or things like that. So yeah, that's a good point. Breda has asked, are there supports for children when a parent is terminally ill?
There are, and what we would talk about in relation to that is anticipatory grief. And there's a lot of really good grief work that can be done during that period. And I think it's a really important time when you can really link in and support that child. Often, if a parent is terminally ill, there can be a lot of hospice support that is given and a lot of interventions at that stage, but absolutely around that anticipatory grief work. Some people, and it's a lot of the research suggests that anticipatory grief can be very helpful because I suppose you have the time to say the things that need to be said to respond. But we have to remember as well that the age of the children and their developmental stage, you know, for young children, it can be very frightening because there are very obvious physical changes. They can be scared of a loved one because they're seeing many of these physical changes and they don't know how to understand those emotions. Now, thankfully, the hospices generally provide a lot of support in that area, but it's a key time, I think, that interventions, rather than after the bereavement, that's a very key time where support can be given to young people.
Right. This is from Claire. When we talk about bereavement or loss, are we always talking about death? Can these theories apply to separation or family splits?
Absolutely, 100%. And that's so important that you can see yourself, and perhaps even when you look at that, the loss of a relationship, a separation, divorce. And I know even from speaking to principals, anecdotally, they have told me that Sometimes a bereavement within a school environment, you can cope with it, you can provide the support, and where the community kind of rallies around. But actually, sometimes separation and divorce, that can be even more challenging, because they might not know that a separation has occurred. It also can be reoccurring. Different traumas are happening to the child. It's not as something that can be talked about, so it can be even more challenging, that type of grief that a young person experiences when it comes to separation and divorce.
Which is a very good point. Like, it's like a hidden grief, because they might not even be aware of what's happening within the family situation.
Exactly. And bereavement is public. It's, might be an RIP.ie, the community, and everyone is aware that it has happened.
Lots of people said, Rita said, absolutely fantastic. The time just flew. Moira has asked, is there training available through Rainbows to set up a support group in schools?
There is, and actually, if you want to email me, Anne Staunton is the CEO of Rainbows Ireland. She sits on the ICBN network. So if there's anything I can help with, my email is Aoife Lynam. I can actually put it into the chat box. It's aoilynam@tcd.ie. And if anyone wants to email me, I can put you in contact with that. And also, I meant to say, we are developing a master's within the School of Education that is looking specifically at this area as well, looking at linking grief and well-being issues for us as teachers.
That's great. And some people have asked about the slides being made available, and I can confirm that they will be, along with the recording, for all the attendees. Lots of people have said, Sinead, thank you, really interesting and helpful presentation, really great webinar, thank you so much. So I think it's, people have really appreciated what you have said. A question came in there from Ashley: how to know when the time is appropriate to work with a child one-on-one when you're an SEN for bereavement, not much emotional work being done at home? Like, how do you do this one-on-one, or when do you start it?
I think it's appropriate. Yeah, and again, I would take the lead from the child. I used to do things in my classroom, and I didn't mention it earlier, and I find it a really good strategy. If I had a child, and this kind of came up to the idea of choice that really emerged from my research, that children really want the choice. So usually ask them. I used to find if there was a child that was saying, no, Aoife, I don't want you to check in with me, I would say, that's no problem. Here is a stone. So I would give them a stone, or I would give them a card, because sometimes children might not have even the language to express or to say, I really need your help, because those can be hard words to say, and for adults, never mind for children. So I used to give them like a stone or a card or something that if they wanted my support, they just left that on my desk. They didn't need to say anything. They didn't need to do anything else, but it let me know that they needed something from me. So I think the main thing would be to ask them, would they like to talk about things? Definitely link in with the parents if you're doing one-on-one work with them. I would say be mindful of any of the strategies. I know there's a grief workbook out there. It's a yellow book, and it's aimed at schools, but it's a very therapeutic book, and it's in the rest of my slides, so you'll see it. So we need to be careful that whatever we do, we don't try and do any therapeutic things that maybe we're not able to close off, because once we open these emotions, we may not be qualified enough to close them off again, and we might be sending children home having opened up these very tough emotions. I think following the SPHE curriculum and talking about emotions from that perspective, using things that are less confronting. There is a lovely book called The Big Bag of Worries, if you have a child that's maybe being anxious, rather than having a book there are books that I really term confronting books, where they're specifically talking about death and dying. And then there are other lovely picture books that manage to talk about these areas in a much more subtle way. And I would be saying, go for the subtle ones, talk about emotions in general, so that the child begins to understand and have that emotional literacy.
That's excellent. And what struck me was the point you made, like in that one of your last slides there, is not to start off with, I know how you feel, rather than, can you tell me what it's like for you? And to start from the child's perspective, and to use listening, which is a very underrated skill, because people want to jump in. They want to be very solution focused. A question here from Grace. I think it's one of our last questions coming in. she is considering organising some sort of gathering for these children coming up to Christmas. Have you any advice?
The advice generally that we get around like memorials and events for children is to keep it, and it sounds like it sounds like it's a general one, because when we do memorials and things like that, or events that are very specific to particular bereavements, it can be then hard to stop them. And it also can be, children can be like, well, my granddad died and why is no one making, because you sometimes see planting trees and things like that, that in particular people's names. And it can be done with the best of intentions, but it can be hard then, because we can't plant trees for every person's bereavement in the school, and then they feel that mine isn't as important as Aoife's was, you know. So I think what you're suggesting already sounds good, because you're talking about a general gathering. And I think even sometimes in November I've seen schools do things where they might have a remembrance tree, and they have maybe some decorations and they put the people's names on the remembrance tree. And doing things like that can be very I think affirming that, you know, at Christmas time, November in remembrance, and then coming into Christmas can be very triggering times. And other times of year that I'm thinking of now, I could stay talking forever about this, but even Mother's Day and Father's Day, I had some young people speak to me and they said, you know, it was the most stressful time of year for them. They knew within weeks they would start developing anxiety because they knew Mother's Day was coming up, or they knew Father's Day was coming up. So my advice is to generally scrap that, anything to do with Mother's Day and Father's Day generally, and just make a card for a loved one, you know, and just keep it as general as possible, because it can be, if you still have the Mother's Day cards and you get the child to make a card, a different card, they can feel so different. Whereas when we're given choice, today we're just going to make a card for someone we love, anyone at all, you know, that can be much better. And letting the child know that you're going to do that, so they're not at home worrying that this day is going to come up and they're going to be flagged as, I don't have a mother or father. But yeah, I think keeping it very general is really important.
And especially if they're grieving like separation or divorce, and the parent is not connected with the family anymore, they can feel very, you know, singled out and might want to pretend doing a card or whatever. The comments have been lovely. I think many people have appreciated the webinar, and we've come to the end. As we said before, the slides will be provided and the recording. But I would really like to take this opportunity to thank you, Aoife, for participating in our Trinity Research and Childhood Centre, which is based in Trinity webinar, and it will continue in 2024. I think you've provided some really good points for many teachers out there and people who work with children, and I've learned a lot as well today. So thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.